to be engaged with young people who are making a difference and understand the value and the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals. I wonder, before we start, if you could open your camera so I can see you, and maybe you could just go around and give your first name and where you're calling in from. So I'll start. I'm Judith. I'm calling in from Trento, Italy, which is in the northern part of Italy.
I'm Ellie, and I'm calling in from the United States. I'm from Virginia in the United States.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rory. I'm calling in from New York City in the United States.
Great. Welcome, Rory.
Ms. Judith, I'm Vidushi here. I'm calling in from India, and I am recently the coordinator who have joined your band and have just followed you here to learn more.
Well, we're glad you're here. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm calling from Tunisia, North Africa, and I'm glad to be here and to meet all of you wonderful people.
Wonderful.
My name is Immaculate, and I'm from Uganda.
Wonderful. Glad you're here.
Hello, everyone. I am Mohammed from Kurdistan.
Wonderful. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. Okay. Well, I'm going to start.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, this is Nakabwa Irene from Uganda. I think some students are their places of work, so they won't be able to like unmute themselves because they're at work, and yet they still have to attend at the same time. I hope that is understandable. Yes, they have sent their apologies. They have sent their apologies in the chat, and I hope that would be okay with you.
Certainly, I understand, but it's exciting to realize, you're welcome, that we're touching North America, Europe, Africa,
yes,
parts of Asia. So we're truly an international group here, and that's so fitting because what we're talking about are global rights, global responsibilities, and global action. So let me start. I'm so glad to know that you know something about the SDGs, but I'm going to just give a quick overview of some of these ideas, and then we'll go into more depth. So my talk today is on human rights and sustainable development, how they're really two sides of the same coin. And this is my organization that I founded, Youth for a Better World. We do a program called Montessori Model United Nations with students from around the world, students from 9 to 15 years of age, in very much the same effort that what you're doing, engaging young people, young minds, and young actions in the Sustainable Development Goals, because after all, they're only going to be able to accomplish them if we do it together. Inspiration for this talk came from former UN Secretary General, His Excellency Kofi Annan, and I understand we have some people from Uganda, so and Guinea maybe, who said, humanity will not enjoy security without development. It will not enjoy development without security, and it will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. So in this statement, he really shows how human rights and development are totally interlinked for security, for peace. And so the agenda for today, I'm going to give a little bit of background of these concepts, where they came from, where did the idea of human rights come from? What about the idea for development, and specifically sustainable development? Then I'll show you a tool that's called the Sustainable Development and Human Rights Tracker that enables us to analyze how countries are doing on both human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. And then finally, I'll end with discussion of the implementation of sustainable development, human rights, with a way to link that to an economy. So how can economics value both the planet and human life? And that's called the donut economy. So just as a way of background, I'm sure you know that there was the World War I in 1914 ended, even though there had been previous agreements to avoid war. When it did end, many of the nations came together and formed the League of Nations. The League of Nations was then countries that came together hoping to avert war. But unfortunately, it was not able to promote international cooperation. In the beginning, Germany was part of the League of Nations, and then it declined, and then the United States never was able to join. So it was really not a League of Nations. Then, of course, we had World War II. The League had failed, and when World War II broke out, still there was a feeling among many of the leaders of the world that there had to be a better way to keep peace among the different countries. And so the idea of forming an international body was started well before the world was ended. It took years of planning and 50 countries to initiate the United Nations. It's a photograph of the United Nations headquarters in New York City. You know, when the United Nations was formed, these high-minded ideas of how the world could achieve peace were documented in the charter. And it's a very inspirational document. And I'd really recommend that you read it, at least the preamble of it, because it sets down the inspiration of how we can create peace among all peoples of the world. So let me just read the first paragraph. Notice how it begins. We, the peoples of the United Nations, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to humanity, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. And finally, to promote social progress and better standards of living in the larger freedoms. And for those ends, there are 4 things it wants to do: to be proactive, I can't read it, to practice tolerance and live together in peace, to unite our strength, and to ensure the acceptance and principles of the individual institution. And finally, to employ international machinery for the promotion of economic and social advancement of all countries. So these lofty ideals, we can actually see from the mission of what the UN is. So they're really these main components. The first is to maintain international peace and security. The second, to promote sustainable development. Third, to protect human rights, uphold international law, and deliver humanitarian aid. So in thinking about these missions of the UN, they really can be looked upon as a 3-legged stool. You know, you can sit on the seat of peace and security if you have human rights, development, that means a chance to be educated, a chance to find meaningful work, and finally to respect the rule of law. So if you think about a country and if there is peace in it, then most likely human rights are respected. There are opportunities for jobs and education, and there is a basic respect for rule of law. And in countries where there is only insecurity and maybe war, one of these 3 pillars is probably missing. So you may wonder, well, where did these ideas come from? How did the United Nations come across them? Well, really, they linked directly to the experience of World War II. Protecting human rights was the result of the crimes that were committed by the Nazis and Hitler. In order to protect the human rights, the creators of the United Nations wanted to ensure that they were a pillar, that they were incorporated right in the beginning. And then the second, the economic and social development, again, that came out of the lack of development as a result of the economic crisis in the 1930s. So there has been much written about the Great Depression across the northern part of the world that led to the rise of Hitler and fascism. So these are really the roots of the pillars of the United Nations. So let's take a look at human rights. What rights do you think you have?
I think in my country, Tunisia, we had a revolution in 2010, 2011. I think we gained the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. I think that's an amazing thing to gain after so many years of being not in democracy. So I value.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, did you know there are 30 fundamental human rights that are universal? They apply to everyone, everywhere. I'm going to show you a short video about human rights.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Well, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human, any...
The rights that humans have.
Oh, that's a very large debate.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, una domanda complicatissima.
Yeah, we just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights, which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded, but the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Well, what did you think of that video? Was there anything you learned that you didn't know before?
It was very inspiring for me. It's because I really hope to be a human rights advocate on an international level. It was very inspiring, honestly. I thought it encourages those who have shared the same ambitions as me.
Yes, absolutely. I love that statement at the end where Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Where, after all, do human rights exist? But in small places, and in our homes, in our neighborhoods." And that sense of empowerment that we are human rights, that if we exercise them, then they exist. But if we don't stand up for human rights, they're just words on a piece of paper. So let me ask you.
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead,
One thing
please.
I really
Rory, go
liked
ahead.
was that this speaks to the debate between universalism versus cultural relevance versus culturalism too, because I actually didn't know the human rights had been codified before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, let's think a little bit about what Eleanor said close to home. Have you ever had an experience where you stood up for the human rights of another person?
I think that human rights are in our everyday lives, whether we seek it or not. But on a national level here in my country, in civil society, we stood up for the right of education for the kids in rural areas and so on. So we organized events to provide them with the right furniture for school and clothes and all that. And we were so proud of that initiative because some of those kids, because of poverty and so on, being a third world country, they were about to quit school, like at the age of 10 and 11 and 12. I was so proud of that. And I think we kind of saved them because we, not only that year, but we also kept up on the next year. So we checked up on them, and we made sure that they didn't drop out, at least at a very young age, because here in my country, the law says that it's compulsory to be in school until the age of 16. But these kids were about on the verge of quitting. So I think we made an impact on that. The education for kids, I I was always someone who believed in education and the importance of education. Also in my final year in high school, I made a project within my studies and all that. I made a whole project about the importance of education and how we can enhance it, because I saw that there was so many let's say mistakes being made here in my country. So the kids are like robots. They study with no analysis and no logical thinking. So I thought that we should change that. Instead of learn this and just come recite it in school and go home, I thought that we should enhance the logical thinking and analysis. So I really think I stood up for education for a very long time now. Thank you.
That's such an important effort.
So in 2021, I was the U.S. youth delegate to the United States at the G20 Youth Summit, which was very exciting because I was the inclusion delegate. And so I got to represent American youth aged 18 to 30 and understand their policy interests and present them on the global level, which was really exciting because I got to learn a lot about people's stories and what motivates them, and really take an intersectional lens to advance human rights.
Wow, how exciting. And to meet people from around the world and to realize that we're all in this together.
Yeah, we wrote a consensus-driven communique, which was really exciting too, because it really allowed us to get a better understanding of what we were actually advocating for, to really agree on those definitions, which is something that I think was really raised in that video too.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Let me ask you if you learned about human rights in school.
No, actually, maybe like in the primary years at 10, 11, they say, oh, we have like this thing called human rights, and that's it. So no details, no nothing. We just know it exists, but we don't know what is it and what does it do. So I think for me, I believe it was a personal effort. And also in college, like being a law student in an international law, I think it was compulsory for me to know it. But like for all people, I don't think here in my country they know.
Well, what do you think would happen if students across the world actually had a chance to learn about human rights?
So I would like to go back to the video that what struck me was that human rights is just not another lesson in history. And I think going back to my schooling and my understanding of human rights was just that. There was no thread that was established. Okay, this is your life. You are the human right, and you are one supposed to be holding it as closely as possible. So I think if we can make that connection to the students right from the school, it would have a greater impact, and each one becomes an ambassador for making sure at least close your area or your close heart, or you take care of it.
Thank you. I really agree with what you're saying, and I've worked with students to take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and turn it into a rights for our classroom, so that they're actually applying the human rights to the way we should conduct ourselves in the classroom. And also with those rights to understand that there comes a responsibility, that if you have these rights, then you need to exercise them. And so knowing that human rights brings a responsibility to make them real for everyone. Okay, any other comments?
Hello.
Yes, please go.
This is Immaculate, and I'm with Irene, and I think for me in my country, well, human rights are being spoken about and they taught to students, but the problem is the implementation. Like this thing, like they talk about the human rights, but there's no implementation. A few of the people implement like what they teach, but it's only in words, like there's no action. Yes, that's what I can say.
Yes, well, that's your job then. Or that's our job to do, I should say. Because even though we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's not the rule of law. Any of the member states of the UN, if they violate human rights, there's nothing that happens to them. Now, maybe there is, condemnation against them by other world leaders, but it really is something like a moral responsibility, like our conscience, to do what is right and to implement the human rights. I think that if we realize that the human rights, that each of us in that sense is an active force for making sure that the human rights get implemented. We may not be able to impact our governments, impact our communities, the people that we are with, our friends, our leaders, our supervisors. It can be very discouraging when, as you say, you live in a country where the human rights are not implemented. But I think by the actions that we take, there's a chance for us to create a difference. The Human Rights Council in Geneva, this was actually a part of the League of Nations, the Human Rights Council. And then when the League of Nations essentially collapsed, the buildings and the archives were given to the new United Nations, But what's really interesting about this ceiling, if you can imagine, it's all of these little pieces, colored pieces, are in 3 dimensions. It's not flat. And wherever you sit in that room, you see a different perspective. So the idea of this meeting room is that to really understand another person, you have to understand first their perspective. So let's go on now to the other pillar of the United Nations for peace and security is sustainable development. And it sounds like you have already been introduced to this, so I'm just going to go over it rather quickly. But at the turn of the century, or just before the turn of the century, His Excellency Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN, and he thought that the best way to bring forward the work of the United Nations was to create a focus on development. And so the 193 member states adopted the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, that were to be accomplished within 15 years. So by 2015. Now, there was good progress that was made, but obviously it wasn't enough to erase the need for more development goals. And so 3 years before the MDGs expired, a group of nations got together in Rio and decided to figure out how they could continue with the MDGs, but now they wanted them to apply to every country, not just the developing countries. So the MDGs really were focused on countries that were developing and not in the developed countries. But in fact, these problems exist in all of our countries, developed or undeveloped or developing. So in 2015, the 193 member states all agreed to these sustainable development goals, and each country agreed to targets that they would meet each year to bring forward the sustainable development goals, and that they had a lifespan of 15 years. What's interesting about the SDGs is that it brought together not just developing and developing countries, but civil society, NGOs, all across the board, that this would be a decade of sustainable action. You might say we moved or evolved from the MDGs to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason why they are continuing is not only because the goals hadn't been fully achieved, but because they had an impact, a significant impact. So more than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty, and child mortality dropped more than half, and the number of out-of-school children dropped by a half, and HIV/AIDS infections dropped by 40%. So you could see that they were worth putting our collective focus to achieving them. The other very smart accomplishment by His Excellency Kofi Annan was that he put together the Global Compact, the UN Global Compact, to bring together the private sector, corporations, to encourage them to collaborate on the goals and to recognize that they could have an impact and a voice that would be respected by their people. And that's so true today that many large corporations have what they call social responsibility goals. And they actually have people who are focused in that corporation of doing something to advance sustainability. Of course, it's not enough, but it is at least an awareness and understanding that, as I said before, we're all in this together, and that corporations have an important part to play. So it sounds like you already know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, and that they each have an image to represent the meaning of that goal. what's interesting to me is that over 90% of the targets of the SDGs are actually embedded in human rights and in treaties for human rights. So if we make progress on the SDGs, we're also making progress on human rights. The SDGs are also organized according to these pillars, that some of the goals really focus on people, such as ending poverty and helping human development, education, jobs. There's a pillar on the planet, how we can preserve our planet for future generations. There's a pillar on prosperity, about creating a green economy so that we have renewable energy. There's a pillar of peace. What are the policies and the rule of law for justice and accountability? And then a partnership that, again, it has to be all working together for shared values and global social responsibility in order for us to achieve the benefits of the SDGs. So we could look upon the SDGs in this graphic, organizing it according to people, the environment, society, and the means piece. So what's interesting is that we can look at these sectors of how the SDGs can individually be organized, but really these SDGs are so interlinked that if you work on one, you're working on many more. So if you take a look at this graphic, for example, if you look at, let's find no poverty. So no poverty is linked to zero hunger, right? If we have zero hunger, it's going to impact poverty. And also number 3, good health and well-being. If there's no poverty, people have a longer lifespan and they have a greater chance of enjoying that life. And so SDG 1 is also linked to economic development and opportunity for jobs. So you can see that all of these have a way of connecting with one another. And this is so true that the SDGs really are interdependent, interlinked, and it's a very effective dynamic for understanding that, you know, as Sarah was saying, she worked for education, but in working for education, let's take a look because that's number 4 to see where, here, quality education. If you're working on quality education, you're also working on number 8, decent work and economic opportunity. You're working on gender equality and entitling women to go to school. You're working on, it's so hard for me to read these, good health and well-being, and also no poverty. By working and you may think, well, I'm just working on SDG 4, but in fact, you're having impact on many, many, many of the SDGs.
Yes, I confirm that, honestly. Because if I may speak very quickly here, because when we worked on that rural area where the kids have no proper education, they also have no proper water, they have no proper like electricity. So I think it's interlinked. And when I saw this, it really came back as a flash to my mind, because we really faced a lot of problems. And I'm personally trying to work on providing the electricity for these schools by this solar energy, so that we can protect the environment also. Yes. I'm trying my best to do that. Sorry for interrupting.
No,
I just wanted to say.
Speaking of a great example, just as a quick overview about the SDGs, if we're organizing them according to peace, prosperity, people, partnerships, and the planet, how are we doing? This is a kind of scorecard. If we were to give all of us, not just one country, but all of us, a scorecard or a record, a grade, we could see that some of these in green, we're doing a little bit better. We get a good. We're not doing so well in health, education, peace, hunger, water, partnerships, and very poorly in ending hunger, access to clean water, to energy, and being very poor in gender equality and industrialization for the least developed countries. And then we get an F in inequality, reducing slums, reducing waste, and combating climate change and protecting our ocean. Some of the goals are easier for us to work on than others, and certainly they're all interlinked, but keeping in mind that we need to also focus on the ones that are harder to achieve. This is a really interesting data software that's come out that links the human rights and the global goals for each of the 193 countries. And as you can see, this is a picture of the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The Human Rights Council and then the Dutch ministry got together to see how we could create a way to be able to measure each country's development on SDGs and human rights. So they developed what's called the Human Rights Data Explorer, and it monitors information about human rights and the targets of the SDGs, and it connects them to the recommendations that the UN has for each of the SDGs. You can look up, and in fact, let me stop sharing for a minute and go to the website here. I wanted to show you, this is a site, and you can put in, your country. So I'm going to put in Italy, where I live, and it will tell me, I can decide I want to look at how Italy's doing for children. So it will give me a number of the recommendations that have been made across for the SDGs regarding children in Italy. And there are many different ways you can explore what's going on in your country. So you can also look for all countries based on each of the SDGs. So I think it's an interesting tool, and it might be something you would like to explore. Oh, I guess you probably didn't see because I didn't share my page. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is an idea that an economist came up with, Kate Ratworth, and it's called the donut economy. And she's been able to apply 2 boundaries for an effective economy that will not only be good for people, but be good for the planet. And she calls it the donut economy because, donuts are the part that has empty in the middle and the inside, and then all this space around there is where we want to be. It's the safe place for humanity, and it's a regenerative and distributive economy. So the 2 foundations are a social foundation to ensure that all of the human rights are met. And then the ecological ceiling ensures that all of what we need to do to ensure the preservation of our planet. And then in between these 2 are what is called the donut economy. So the social boundaries have to do with the human rights, as I said, access to food, water, energy, health, having a political voice, gender equality, right to housing, right to education. And then the planetary boundaries, which are climate change, ozone depletion, acidification of our oceans, the use of fresh water, the way we use land for agriculture, and maintaining biosphere integrity. So between these 2, environmental protection and social development link together to create a prosperous environment, a prosperous economic environment, which of course is also one way that countries measure themselves. And so this donut economy is actually being applied. The very first city to apply it is Amsterdam, although other cities have adopted it, such as Brussels and Melbourne, Australia, and it's coming before the European Commission to consider being adopted for across Europe. Good about the donut economy is that it's really inclusive. It gives visibility to the cooperative side of people, the caring side of human behavior, and it also takes into account the protection of our environment. I hope that my talk today has helped you see how embedded the human rights are in the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you for speaking with us. Thank you for coming.